Pearl Harbor, a U.S. base in Honolulu, Hawaii, was suddenly attacked December 7, 1941, by the Japanese. Over 2,400 Americans died during the attack, and 1,000 were wounded. The Japanese had attacked many other places in the past, such as Sarawak, British Borneo, Thailand, Indochina, and Manchuria. The reason for the Pearl Harbor attack was that the Japanese were blocked from receiving important materials such as steel and aviation fuel. The United States placed this embargo because Japan tried to take over more territory. Millions of people gave their lives fighting for fascism and imperialism, but Pearl Harbor was the event that forever changed the course of human history. Sam Graves. In response to the attack on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which called the exclusion and internment for all Japanese Americans from the West Coast, where the majority of the Japanese Americans lived, outside of Hawaii. The exclusion and incarceration of Japanese Americans began in March 1942. Relocation of the Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II was one of the most flagrant violations of civil liberties in American history. According to the census of 1940, 127,000 persons of Japanese ancestry lived in the United States, the majority on the West Coast. There were 10 internment camps which were located in California, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arkansas, eventually holding 120,000 people. Fears abounded about a possible fifth column cooperation among Japanese Americans living in Hawaii and on the West Coast. Japanese leaders in California who are counseling their people, both aliens and native-born, to cooperate with the Army in carrying out the evacuation plans are in effect offering the best possible way for all Japanese to demonstrate their loyalty to the United States. The government has a history of not treating people fairly, from the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II to African Americans in the Civil Rights era. Rand Paul.
That stereotype of Asian Americans as the enemy was all too real for George Takei from his very youngest days growing up in Los Angeles.
I remember that morning, and in fact, I can never forget that morning. It was a terrifying morning. I was in the living room looking out the front window, and I saw two soldiers come marching up our driveway, and I saw at the end of their rifles shiny bayonets. They stomped up to our front door at our two-bedroom home on Garnet Street in Los Angeles and banged on the front door. It was terrifying. My father answered, and we were ordered out of our home.
I look at my grandparents and what they dealt with in the Japanese internment in Arizona. That sense of perseverance of making the best out of an incredibly bad situation has always been something I drew inspiration from. I always ask myself, what in the world do I have to complain about? Scott Fujita. Families slept in barracks that were 6 one-room apartments. Each family got one apartment with a wood-burning stove, a light hanging from the ceiling, and one cot for each person. They didn't have plumbing in the barracks. They were guarded by 8 towers with machine guns. If you would try to escape, you would be killed if caught. The U.S. justified its action by claiming that there was a danger of Japanese Americans spying for Japan. No man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it. There can be no appeasement with ruthlessness. There can be no reasoning with incendiary bomb. Franklin D. Roosevelt. More than 2/3 of those interned were American citizens, and half of those were children. None had shown disloyalty to the nation. During the entire war, only 10 people were convicted of spying for Japan, and they were all Caucasian. When Roosevelt signed the executive order 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese were locked up in internment camps. The San Francisco News article said, "Whatever the philosophy involved, the enemy's agents in our town are not neglecting an attempt to create a Japanese Negro anti-white race fifth column." San Francisco News, March 2, 1942. Because of the extreme difficulty in distinguishing between loyal Japanese Americans, and there are many who are loyal to this country, and those other Japanese whose loyalty is to the Mikado, I believe in the wholesale evacuation of the Japanese people from coastal California, Governor Olson said. the San Francisco News. When President Roosevelt revoked Executive Order 9066, which created the conflict, the Japanese were released from the internment camps. Finally getting out of the camps was a great day. It felt so good to get out of the gates and just know you were going home. Finally. Home wasn't where I left it though. Getting back, I was just shocked to see what had happened. Our home was being bought by a different family, different decorations in the windows. It was our house, but it wasn't anymore. Aya Nakamura.
They couldn't even call us citizens then. We were enemy non-aliens. Why? Because of this. We were taken to the horse stables. And thinking back now, I can't imagine how degrading and humiliating it must have been for my parents to take their 3 children, one a baby, from a 2-bedroom home and told to sleep in that narrow, smelly horse stall. I remember the barbed wire fences and the sentry tower, the searchlight that followed me when I made the night runs from our barrack to the latrine. It was a racist act, pure and simple, and it was an unconstitutional act. I mean, you can't imprison people for their race, and that's what we were imprisoned for.
Fred Korematsu was an American civil rights activist who opposed to Japanese internment during World War II. Korematsu and his family were to be relocated. Although his family followed the order, Fred failed to submit to relocation. He was arrested on May 30th and eventually was taken to Transforeign Relocation Center in San Bruno, south of San Francisco. The Supreme Court agreed to hear his appeal, and oral arguments were held on October 11, 1944. In a 6-3 ruling issued on December 18th, the court upheld Korematsu's conviction. Writing for the majority, Justice Hugo L. Black argued. Compulsory exclusion of large groups of citizens from their homes, except under circumstances of duress, emergency, and peril, is inconsistent with our basic governmental institutions. But when, under conditions of modern warfare, our shores are threatened by hostile forces, the power to protect must be commensurate with the threatened danger. The Japanese sacrificed a lot to create the compromise. They sacrificed their homes, their businesses, their freedom, and much more. I think the Japanese were grateful that they were finally free, but still missed their loved ones that died from the internment camps. The Japanese were treated very cruelly, and the event killed 1,862 people at the camps. At the end, the sides have compromised, and they got what they wanted. The Japanese were released, and each survivor was given $20,000, August 10, 1988. The Japanese also sued the federal government for $24 billion. It is still worth examining because it was a very tragic event that happened in history. 66% of the Japanese Americans that went to the internment camps were born in the U.S. and had never been to Japan. We were American citizens. We were incarcerated by our American government in American internment camps here in the United States. The term Japanese internment camp is both grammatically and factually incorrect. George Takei. One person can make a difference, even if it takes 40 years. Fred Korematsu. President Ford issued a formal apology to the internees in 1976, saying their incarceration was a setback to fundamental American principles, and Congress authorized the payment of reparations in 1988. The episode remains, for many, a living memory. Now, with immigration reform proposals targeting entire groups as suspects, it resonates as a painful historical lesson.